I don't like the word unoptimized. It's a useful term, don't get me wrong. It covers the whole gamut of problems suffered by particularly the PC gaming industry, from titles whose scope and graphical quality don't justify their oversized system requirements, to games that clearly weren't playtested enough before they went live. I just feel like those of us who talk about this stuff on the internet have latched onto this one particular phrase, and now we use it for everything. Pretty new game doesn't run well on my older machine? Unoptimized. Remaster of old game also needs a hardware upgrade to run? Unoptimized. Sometimes people just feel like the march of technological progress has been outpaced by the increase in prices, and I can completely relate to that. Capitalism is pretty fucking unoptimized. Some developers, however, just want to watch the world burn. Their games might be optimized by their own internal definition, but we seem to have pretty different ideas of what that word actually means. In this video, I've taken a few of the most notoriously ill-optimized games of the last few years and run them on two different PCs with very different upbringings. On the one hand, we have the upper crust, a Ryzen 7 9800X3D powered monster with a king's ransom in DDR5 and a GeForce RTX 5090, the latter of which was kindly provided by Scan Computers UK. On the other hand, we have a PC from the other side of the tracks, built around 2019 and still hanging in there, still higher than the minimum requirements of almost every game, but with an original cost price that's less than the current value of the RAM in the fancy PC. I'm only slightly exaggerating. I built these two rigs with the idea of exploring the class divide in PC gaming, and in the first video in the series I found that the older, cheaper rig holds up surprisingly well. Of course, only one game in that video really fit the definition of unoptimized. Borderlands 4, a game that, at max settings, is still incapable of a consistently high frame rate on a PC that costs over £5,000 in 2026. Gearbox's CEO Randy Pitchford insisted that the game was perfectly optimized and that gamers should be less afraid of technology like DLSS, Nvidia's machine learning powered upscaler that can make 1440p look pretty close to 4K and is especially good for keeping older RTX 20 series GPUs relevant. Gamers, however, felt that Randy's game didn't warrant making even this minimal sacrifice. It's not Cyberpunk or Alan Wake 2 or even Crysis. It's just Borderlands. It shouldn't take the most powerful hardware, the latest AI performance-enhancing wizardry, and a drop in standards to enjoy it at 4K 60. It was, however, the latest in a long line of games whose juice wasn't worth the squeeze. Kicking off with one of my favourite games of all time, as well as one of the worst PC ports ever made. Respawn's Jedi Survivor was built using Unreal Engine 4, a now somewhat dated engine, but one which is still capable of excellent visuals, at the expense of intolerable amounts of stutter. Thankfully, there was enough of an uproar over the terrible state of the game at launch that the devs went back and tried to iron out some of the initial problems. Eventually. Starting with a performance comparison, the RTX 5090 can comfortably run the game at 4K with the quality settings maxed out. I say comfortably, but even with a 9800X3D, the top-end system isn't immune to the occasional stutter. The benchmark run through Kobo towards Pyloon's Saloon averages close to 100 FPS, but 1% lows are only in the 60s. You might think, as I did, that this would mean you could use a 60 FPS cap to deliver a perfectly smooth experience, and you'd be perfectly wrong. There are still bumps in the road, meaning for a 59.9 FPS average with 1% lows of 47.6. Meanwhile, the budget system requires a few settings reductions as well as a drop in resolution. I've chosen to target somewhere above 60 FPS wherever possible, and in this game that requires 1080p with quality DLSS, rendering internally at 720p. Ray tracing works, but the average in my Kobo run falls to 50 FPS at the high preset, Power for Life baby, and turning it off sends the average up to 74 FPS. The 1% lows are proportionally lower than the expensive rig thanks to the older 6-core CPU with the smaller 32MB L3 cache. Locking to 60 is also a little less smooth than the X3D system, with 1% lows about 10% lower. When it comes to quality settings and resolution, the expensive system is showing Survivor's graphics in their best possible light, and the quality is great. Okay, I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little disappointed because I've seen path tracing now, so I know video games can look better than this, but I guess it's an area where the upcoming third game could potentially improve. Anyway, that's not really what's important. What matters is how much of a drop the budget PC experiences. The loss of RT is occasionally noticeable. There's a glitch in the intro cinematic that occurs both with and without DLSS, but which disappears when RT is enabled. This is a throwback to an old glitch where Cal's hair always glowed bright orange when RT was turned off, as ambient occlusion didn't seem to apply to it. Now, I don't know if this occurs on all GPUs, I might have to try some more just to satisfy my personal curiosity, but it's a pretty big glitch, even if I didn't really notice it after this point in the story. Weirdness aside, image quality looks fine, especially considering it's only 720p. There's some blotchy noise in shaded areas, and more noticeable pop-in as you move through the landscape, but it's mostly happening a good distance ahead of Cal, and honestly, I kinda feel like I'm nitpicking by pointing it out. Another game I enjoyed enough to play all the way through, Bethesda's Starfield is nevertheless known for being particularly brutal on lower-end hardware, despite being generally pretty mediocre looking. Some of the worlds of Starfield are beautiful and detailed when compared to previous efforts like 2011's Skyrim, but don't really justify just how much load they put on GPUs and especially CPUs compared to other recent titles. There are still clear loading screens between the spaceflight sequences and planet-side gameplay, and if David Braben hadn't made a game called Frontier Elite 2 in 1993, which allowed you to planet hop through an entire solar system without a single loading screen, then maybe it wouldn't be quite so egregious. But he did, and it is. Playing Starfield on the Richie Rich PC, you'd probably never even know about its reputation for bad optimization. My standard run through New Atlantis averages nigh on 100 FPS at native 4K Ultra, with 1% lows of 83. Basically a perfect experience, no notes. Moving on to the budget rig, and ooh boy, this is far from perfect. 60 FPS in New Atlantis just ain't gonna happen. Even at low settings, with balanced DLSS it falls short, and the graphics look terrible. Like there's a depth of field filter that turns everything beyond a few meters in front of the player into an MPEG compression nightmare. I don't know which specific setting avoids this, but the medium preset certainly fixes things and gives an average of 53 FPS. While the GPU is mostly the limiting factor, CPU utilization is still extremely high, and the 1% lows are just 37 FPS, thanks to a ton of frame time spikes that kind of ruin the experience. As for image quality, aside from the obvious resolution difference, there are still moments where the cheap PC can look obviously worse than the expensive one, and I think they might be avoidable. As good as DLSS is, it can sometimes clash with post-processing effects with unpleasant results, and the DOF effect during conversations can look a bit off with this much upscaling. Perhaps fiddling with the DLSS model would help, but I didn't find it obnoxious enough to be worth trying in this game. That would come later. In the meantime, as I mentioned with Claire Obscure in the previous video, I don't like disabling depth of field effects, but if it's a problem and it's ruining your experience of the game, you could always just turn it off. Marvel's Spider-Man 2 is a former Sony exclusive, originally designed to be a showcase for the PS5, with its 16GB of fast unified RAM and customised high-performance SSD. This is presumably some of the excuse for why the PC version, released in 2025, runs like absolute wank. Starting this time with the universal minimum spec PC, and at 1080p high with quality DLSS in legacy mode and RT disabled, the average frame rate is 69. Yes, I know the extra 0.6 means I should round up, but you're not taking this away from me, damn it. There's nothing funny about 66. Swinging low along Broadway does cause the familiar spikes in the frame time graph that I've been complaining about since I first tested the game, and the 1% lows are just 46. A problem like that can only be solved by throwing money at it, right? Maybe not. Granted, the max spec PC is running with ray tracing cranked, as is its right as a multi-$1,000 gaming rig, but it has a crippling effect on performance. At native 4K it only manages around 50 FPS, and the constant traversal stutter means lows of just 32 FPS. Again, to reiterate, you can't buy a better consumer GPU than this right now, and even the professional ones don't clock this high, so you probably won't see 60 FPS from one of those either. There are a couple of CPUs that might be a few points faster than the 9800X 3D, but I'm comfortable saying that this is about as good as a gaming PC gets right now, and while the game does look fantastic, it's not enough to justify this low of a frame rate. Now, I'm not too proud to enable DLSS, and that is transformative to performance while still looking sharp. The average is up to 83, and while the spikes are still happening, they're a little less egregious. The only surefire solution I've found to this problem is frame generation, and I dare say this could be a perfect use case for DLSS 4.5's new dynamic MFG. But that's not out yet, and I'm still somewhat hesitant to talk about frame generation as if it's a performance enhancer, rather than high-tech motion smoothing. Quality differences between the two are not night and day, but you can see what your money is buying. Details during cutscenes are a little bit fudged on the budget PC due to the legacy DLSS, and the lack of ray tracing shows particularly in the shadows, which the rasterized ambient occlusion renders just a bit too bright. That aside, I still think this is a great looking game overall, and I don't think dropping to the high preset is a bad compromise at all. I just wish you could traverse NYC without all these damn stutters. Next up is the largely forgotten Dragon's Dogma 2, the first of two notoriously unoptimized games made using Capcom's previously well-regarded RE engine. The engine that gave us beautiful visuals and decent performance in the Resident Evil series turned out to be an optimization nightmare once it was applied to larger game worlds. I learned my lesson from DD2, and so I never got round to buying the equally terrible PC port of Monster Hunter Wilds. But one person who was brave enough to jump in anyway is Daniel Owen. He continues to chart that game's journey towards optimization, even though he doesn't even like it. Good for him. I find that Dragon's Dogma 2 looks and feels like a high-def remaster of a PS3 game, which I don't intend as an insult, but it does set it apart from the distinctly next-gen looking games like Spider-Man 2, and yet it suffers the same performance drops in populated areas that we see in much more modern games. Tested in the first major city area in the game, the max spec rig manages a whopping 103 FPS at maximum settings, but frame time spikes see the 1% lows drop to 63. Not the end of the world, but again, the old tactic of capping the frame rate to 60 doesn't help much. Now the 1% lows fall to 46. The min-spec machine is held back by both its CPU and GPU. The prioritized performance preset still triggers a VRAM warning on an 8GB GPU like this 2060 Super, and that means I need to drop textures to the low 0.5GB setting to fit within the available memory. However, in the city, the CPU is the limiting factor, and the GPU is only operating at about 2/3 of its potential, so I was able to add some nicer AA and AF modes to clean up edges and textures a little. With or without DLSS, the min-spec machine averages around 49 FPS and sees lows as far as 32, and either way, the GPU still has more to give. Outside of the city, where there are fewer NPCs to process, DLSS would actually help a little. I used VSync for some of the gameplay capture, just to minimise the amount of tearing for my viewers who are sensitive to it, and that caps the FPS to 60, but without DLSS there were moments that fell below the 60 mark. In gameplay though, image quality takes a real nosedive on the lower spec machine. LODs are much closer, meaning that objects and shadows can flicker and appear low quality until you get right up close to them. Perhaps there's some tuning that could be done, especially if you're willing to tolerate a lower FPS, even in lighter areas, but targeting 60 FPS means for a pretty ugly experience in Dragon's Dogma 2. This is actually the first time I've featured Hogwarts Legacy on the channel, and I only happen to have a copy now because it was given away for free by EGS last year. Like Jedi Survivor, it's a UE4 game, and that might explain some stuff. On the premium PC, performance is largely acceptable while running around the school, though RT does cause the frame rate to drop from time to time in more complex scenes. The real issues come in the village of Hogsmeade, where the combination of open-world environments, large assortment of NPCs, and ray-traced lighting all cause more load than the CPU can handle. The RTX 5090 doesn't even have a chance to prove its worth, operating at 50 to 70% most of the time, and averaging just 58 FPS with lows of 37. Dropping RT would resolve this and see a much improved frame rate across the board, but it's kind of galling that it's needed on the max spec gaming PC in 2026. On the minimum spec machine, however, RT really isn't on the cards at all, which is a shame because while I found 1080p high to be largely playable, it suffers the same bright hair problem as Jedi Survivor and Spider-Man 2. Hogsmeade is still CPU limited on the weaker system, but because we're not calculating rays, it's actually performing a little better, averaging 65 with lows of 39. Aesthetically, aside from the lack of RT, there isn't really a lot to complain about. In a side-by-side comparison, you can clearly see the difference, but otherwise, the low-spec PC looks just fine. I don't really think The Last of Us Part 1 really belongs on this list anymore. The game launched with a ton of issues, and at the time 4 and 6GB graphics cards were a lot more common than they are today, so its admittedly too high VRAM requirements were more problematic in 2023 than they are 3 years later. In those 3 years, it seems like the issues have been fixed to the point where I don't have much to complain about anymore. Plus, one of the things implied by the word unoptimized is the idea that the game isn't worth the investment. I use Borderlands 4 as the prime example of a game that doesn't look like it should be as challenging as it is, whereas The Last of Us is one of the best looking games around. Now, anyway. The expensive PC runs the game at native 4K with max settings and averages over 120 FPS with lows of 104, which is a very respectable ratio and should provide a very smooth experience. The sequel is a little more optimised, so it can manage higher frame rates in similar scenes, but we're not talking about a competitive Twitch shooter here. The only practical difference between 120 FPS and 180 is bragging rights. The min-spec machine can still manage a playable frame rate at the high preset, but it needs some upscaling, and this is where I had to do some fine-tuning. DLSS-Q is pretty much mandatory to hit 60 FPS, but out of the box, the DLSS version being implemented is not ideal. There are clear motion trails that are nothing to do with the motion blur setting, and while this means a very acceptable 72 FPS average with near 60 FPS minimums, I don't think I could tolerate that for the whole game. Thankfully, there's a solution. Recent driver updates mean it's possible to select different DLSS models in the Nvidia app, and while I didn't take the time to try all of them to see which is best, I did find that Model K, the recommended one for RTX 20 series GPUs, completely eliminates the trails, looks very sharp in the final image, and only costs about 10% of the frame rate. It might be worth stepping down to DLSS balance to regain some of that lost performance, if you can tolerate a slightly softer image. A notorious name I've managed to steer clear of so far in this video is Unreal Engine 5. UE5 has been the common denominator in dozens of unoptimized releases of the last few years. Black Myth Wukong, Avowed, Metal Gear Solid Delta, Silent Hill 2, The Outer Worlds 2, Stalker 2, Remnant 2, to name just a few. It's clearly not impossible to make a good performing game in this engine, as Ark Raiders has proven, but the hit rate is now so low that it's no wonder we all expect The Witcher 4, Cyberpunk 2 and OD will all run like ass. I could have filled this video with UE5 games, but I didn't want to give the impression that Epic's latest engine is the only culprit, so I've narrowed it down to just one: Oblivion Remastered. This is the most egregious example of a UE5 game, because it's not just UE5. The old buggy Gamebryo engine from the 2006 original release is still there, buried under the ray-traced surface and serving to compound the performance issues that already come with Unreal. Traversal stutter is present on both the high-spec and low-spec machines, and I'm told it gets worse over time. I ran out of patience for the game pretty quickly after walking into the first tavern I found.
Yes, the Imperial City is located on a large island surrounded by Lake Romana. Go on.
Are you sure?
Any news from the other provinces?
I can't
Something
stand
I'd like
the
to talk
sight
about.
of those creatures.
Take care.
Take care.
Take care. Hello.
You've seen way shrines in the wilderness?
They say
Those who
that the
please the
priests
Nine may
and
receive blessings
priestesses
of willpower
chapel
at the
of
way
Dogma
shrines of Mara.
have all been murdered.
Go on.
No one
I think
even
we're in
knows
for
who
some
did
hard
it.
times.
I heard there's
The
a
death
prophet in
of
Amber
Uriel
who seems
Septim
to
and
know
his
what's going
heirs
on.
changes
Although
everything.
At native 4K with everything cranked up, the Billionaire's Plaything fails to consistently hit 60 FPS, falling into the 50s in busier scenes. Adding quality DLSS averages 79 FPS with lows of 61, and enabling an external 60 FPS cap in RevaTuner actually delivers a pretty solid 60 most of the time. Hitting a 60 average on the 2019 budget build requires dropping hardware RT altogether, choosing the high quality preset with low software lumen, and pushing DLSS all the way up to performance. DLSSP doesn't look bad at all, to be fair, and I restarted the game to make sure it was definitely applied. Perhaps fiddling with the models in the Nvidia app could fine-tune quality even further, but as it stands, this is an acceptable performance. Well, not from the game. It looks pretty enough, but there's no way it should need more DLSS upscaling than Hogwarts Legacy. The remake of Dead Space was one of the rash of badly performing titles to release in 2023, and like Jedi Survivor and the rest of them, it's also been subject to a whole torrent of patches since then. I never played the game before making this video, so I can only judge its launch performance by the experiences of others, but while it seems to be a vast improvement from what I saw in DF's coverage back in the day, I don't think it's been completely fixed. At least on the fancy PC, there are still a few slowdowns when entering new areas. I kind of forgot to run a benchmark, though it appears to be in the high refresh territory most of the time, but stutters do lessen the experience somewhat. On the less fancy system, I dropped from Ultra to High and added quality DLSS. The Nvidia app couldn't choose specific models, but I didn't have any of the trails I saw in The Last of Us, and the quality was generally pretty good. I did at least remember to do a benchmark run this time, and it still averages 92 FPS with lows of 60, but the spikes are still just as frequent while you explore the Ishimura. Incidentally, I'd given this game a miss because of its reputation for being badly optimized, but it's awesome. I might actually get around to playing it. In the first video in this series, I wanted to show that PC gaming isn't all about the PCMR, that a 6-year-old, lower-budget gaming PC can still handle modern titles without destroying their graphics in the process, and that the shitty shape of the hardware industry doesn't have to mean that you don't get to enjoy new releases. A plethora of unoptimized games have somehow made it to market over the last half-decade, either from rushed releases, lazy development, or a misunderstanding of how current events were affecting the hardware their customers had access to. This torrent of garbage kinda threatened to undermine the whole optimistic message I was trying to put out into the world, so I felt like I needed to address them. I know some people would argue that it's better to ignore unoptimized games and hope they go away. Stop giving screen time to games that don't respect us and the money we invest into our PCs, and I generally agree. But sometimes it's hard to ignore them, because it feels like they're taking up all the air in the room. The wild thing is, some games are so unoptimized to this day that it affects even the cream of the PC hardware crop, stuff that wasn't even available when the games were new and isn't likely to be superseded for another year or more. Sure, I've not spent a lot of time dropping settings, fine-tuning DLSS models, or searching Nexus mods for performance fixes, and if I wanted to get a more optimised experience on a 9800X3D and an RTX 5090, then I guess I could do that. But part of the reason these stupidly powerful things exist is so that rich people can just click ultra settings and get the best gaming experience. Think of it. Rich people not getting what they want. Anyway, I've got a few more ideas for games I want to compare on these two PCs. One idea has been eliminated because it looks like people really don't care how these things play multiplayer games, but I'm going to work on the graphical showcase video next and follow up with the most popular and well-reviewed games, because I feel like the min-spec PC is going to do really well in both of those categories. If you haven't watched part 1 yet and are wondering why I didn't feature any Borderlands 4 benchmarks in this video, check it out at the link on screen. Now, thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.